Welcome to the We Are All Dying podcast. I'm your host, Jen Goodhand, and my hope is that through these conversations, we become more comfortable, confident, and competent talking about death. On today's show, we have Olga Nikolajev. She is a thanatologist, an end of life nurse educator, and the founder and director of the Death Doula Ontario Network. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. Please let us know what speaks to you and what you'd like to hear next. Welcome to the show, Olga. I'm so grateful to have you with me today.
Thanks for having me, Jenna.
There are so many things that we could talk about because you have such a breadth of experience in the world of death care and end of life support. So I just want to start at the beginning and sort of see where in your own life journey did death become something that you felt you had a calling to support or be involved in?
It's an interesting thing to contemplate or reflect on death, and when was the kind of pivotal point of turning things around. And I'm not sure. I'll talk about a couple of things, but I think it's something that one will contemplate at some point in time during their whole life. And so I think being here in human form is the starting point to start to think about and talk about and be informed about death, because we are all going to die. And so everything organic actually dies. It's not only reserved to us humans, making us more special, but in this physical reality, everything has its own cycle, an entry point and an exit. I think for me, what was the recognition that I wanted to spend my I'm not sure about life, although it's probably true. My life dedicating to studying and contemplating and teaching some aspect of end of life was I was trained as a registered nurse. And so in my early 20s, I actually specialized in labor and delivery because I figured bringing new form in, new persons in was going to be a happy event. And oftentimes it is. It does also include death as well. But I found myself in a situation where I actually couldn't get any work. And so I ended up moving. I lived in Ontario at the time. I moved to British Columbia. And the only job I could get was working in a long term care home. And so I recognized as a young nurse a couple of things. One is that birth and death are very similar, creates a lot of chaos, not only for the person, but the family and the community and the ripple effect that it has. Two, that as a nurse, I actually wasn't trained in the spiritual, emotional, and the mental aspects that oftentimes impact and get engaged during that particular process. And so I wanted to find a way, and I also found that there were those similarities, right, between the two. And I wanted to expand not only my own knowledge, but also share that knowledge with others. So that was a pivotal point of understanding my own gap, and then kind of putting the energy behind it to then spend the next 25 years in different areas that would inform the way in which I provided support and service for people at the end of life.
Wow, that's so interesting. That's really interesting to imagine starting out in a certain place, but all part of the cycle that we're all going to go through. And so, thinking back to your younger self, are there some things that, some ideas you had on life, death that have changed significantly? That, I mean, I bet there have been.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. I think that as somebody, as a single non kids, human kids, 50-year-old woman, I have a very different view on my life, as well as what does death, what does end of life, what does dying, what does grief mean to me, and it has changed. I remember in my 20s, I would idealize, I would have, maybe I wanted to have this expectation that I would have no regrets, that at the end of my life be like, oh, I took on the world and I did everything and I did no harm and I have no regrets. And so now, 25 plus years after that initial thought in my 20s, I recognize that while the goal may be great to heal and to resolve and to reestablish relationships that may have caused some harm or what have you, I realized that there are probably going to be things left undone. And it's part of, um, because part of my own training is not only about how do we better support the expected deaths, but how do we manage, how do we cope with, how do we um, integrate the unexpected losses, disconnections that we have with people. Um, and I'm going to go off a little bit, but it's interesting. I think that I have continued to see death and dying as a very relational and human experience, but I also see a lot of nuances and a lot of the ways in which um, the future will inform and the new generations will inform, and there will be changes. And as we acquire more knowledge, it shifts. It shifts our way of thinking about it, our way of preparing for and being with.
Mm, absolutely. Was there a death in your own life that significantly influenced how you've sort of come to these terms?
Again, as a young child, it's integrating a loss or a death is very dependent on the developmental age of the child and their understanding. I think through the stories, through the revealing of the stories and the retelling of some of my ancestral stories, there have been some death impacts that I wasn't necessarily conscious of, but did influence and continue to be an influence. So as an example, I am named after my great grandmother, who was actually killed during the Bolshevik uprising in Russia in 1918. And my grandfather, her son, fled and immigrated to Czechoslovakia at the time where I was born, where he met my grandmother and then had my father and then had me. And so there's this link to my name. And I didn't know specifically about that story until I was much older, right? Because it's not something that I knew that I was named after her, but I didn't realize that she was actually killed. And I think she was probably in her 40s. She probably wasn't, um, you know, old age, right? And it was that unexpected death, the assault kind of to our family lineage. And then there were those pivotal aware moments of death. So I went to a very small high school, and my grandparents had already, three of my grandparents had already died by the time I was 18. When I went through high school, there was a death almost every single year. For the 5 years, because this was going back where we had grade 13, there was a loss every single year. One or two people some of them were ill, some of them had unexpected, suicide. We had quite a bit of suicide in the school too. And so that had a huge impact. And I was oftentimes the person that folks turned to for some of that comfort. Um, yeah. And then in my 20s, there was other moments of supporting folks, not only through my nursing career, but also personally. And that has continued. It's not like folks who work in end of life care only have that experience from their clients or from the patients, right? They also have that experience in their life circumstances.
Absolutely.
And oftentimes you have more and more deaths as you go, as you get older. So now I'm anticipating, right? I'm at that age where I'm anticipating my parents' death, and all of the other losses that are and my own as well, even though I haven't been diagnosed with and I don't have any life limiting terminal illness. I know that I am going to die. And so how do I best prepare myself and all the things so that I don't have a a negative impact on the people that I leave behind, especially with all of my personal responsibilities.
You said something really interesting that has not come up in a conversation yet, which is the people who have died before we were born. That's a very interesting realm of death, of people who are connected to us, but we never knew, and how that plays a role in who we are, right?
Absolutely.
Mm.
Right. I mean, that's, if you have read any kind of thanatology or what I call sometimes death philosophy, Stephen Jenkinson, who wrote a book called Die Wise, he's a Canadian palliative care social worker who has also done some community death care. He really wants to ensure that everyone, lay folks, do not create a dependence on professionals when it comes to caring for people at the end, but really develop their own confidence and competence. And he talks about the fact that for many Caucasian folks, part of the movement and the migration and the immigration and the growth and development and maybe the loss of our connection to our land because we're moved around so much, that we've actually lost that ancestral lineage, and that is one of the reasons why we have death phobia.
Mm.
That it's an unconscious thing. But I have done certain spiritual work in which, number one, I am confronted by my ancestors who are not in physical form anymore, and I am also able to heal some of those relationships to those ancestors who are not in physical form, because that relationship still has an impact on me in a physical form, even though they're not. But the tie, right? I was also trained as a psychotherapist. And so some of the work as a therapist would be to assist people in helping them to heal some of those relationships, and using imagination, using visualization, using the chair technique as a way of conversing with, unburdening themselves of some of the hurts or the pain or the regrets or the horrible trauma, and then being able to heal some of that aspect. Very interesting, right?
Really fascinating. Absolutely. So, speaking about Thanatology, can you give a little overview of what that is?
Sure. So thanatology in a nutshell is a field of study looking at death and dying, the death system, the way in which, death education, on all aspects of death and dying, not only related to humans, but related to even, all forms. That's a little really broader, but it's really looking at sort of the death systems. This is this is an international handbook of thanatology that was recently developed by a number of thanatologists, grief counselors, end of life educators, hospice palliative care folks, as a way of talking about the death system. How do we come to understand death? What is the language that they will use? What are the religious cultural influences that impact all of it? Ethics, right? All of it. So it's a huge study. And so I am called a thanatologist. Most people are like, you're a what? I don't know what that means, right? Thana is the Greek word for death. Oftentimes it's the Grim Reaper. Uh, but it is a really large field of study. I would say probably a good 50% of the study in thanatology is around grief and bereavement, helping to better understand how we are impacted by loss experiences, not only personal losses or physical losses, but even symbolic losses, all of the other losses of, again, that disconnect from the thing that, or the person or the place, or that we find meaningful, right? So
Mm.
helping us to better recognize what is considered quote unquote normal or common. How can we offer support? What is the best way to support people through that?
Right. Yeah, it's interesting. The term death education, there's so many things that we learn about that are part of our formal education. And even as we get older, the things that we gravitate to learn. But death seems to be one of those things that many of us just don't want to learn about. We don't want to talk about it. We don't want to come close to it. What are your thoughts on that? Why do you think that
Well,
I'm uncomfortable with death?
I'm not sure how well we do in the death education process. I sometimes link death education with sex education. That we sometimes, consider. I think there's probably more sex education than there is death education or grief education, right? So I think that there's still a lack in how we inform, how we educate our communities, our social people, right, about these aspects. And so I think because here's what I hypothesize that the influence of especially our Canadian culture, if I was to pinpoint it, is I think that um, we've kind of um, not avoided or ignored, but because it hasn't been part of our everyday, we've secularized, that's the word I'm looking for, our society. And in so doing, we actually have disconnected from some of the faith-based and religious communities which hold much of the death education, right? So part of your faith or religious studies, that's where you find a lot of the, education about how to live your life so that when you do die, you don't have the regrets, that you are the best person possible so that you can enter the space of divine peace. And I think regardless of what religion or faith people are, I think fundamentally people want to die in peace. I have yet to, although I haven't met every single person in this world, but it's rarely that somebody wants to die a painful death, or sometimes that can happen, especially when there's a kind of a thinking that the pain is the way through, right? To kind of what's the word I'm looking for? Pay for the pain that you have caused, you then go through the pain before you leave. But I think that that's been a fundamental reason why we kind of don't look at death. I think sometimes if we label our society as death ignorant or death avoidant, then that's still in some way a pointing to the personhood or the individual. And while I would say that death education, sex education are often the primary um, responsibility for the parents to designate that information, I think it's a social thing as well, right? So how do we socialize? How do we educate and inform? And so that is why for 50 years we've now had this kind of gap in death education. So only those who work within, and only those who work within, right? Even consider within the healthcare system, although every single healthcare provider could find themselves being at the presence of death, they're not necessarily taught some of the um, more quality improving or holistic or robust understanding of how to care for people at the end, right? Consider that it's not a mandatory thing for physicians or nurses to take palliative care. We have a week end of life care. Here's what you maybe do, right? Because there's so much specialization.
Hmm.
That's
So,
kind of a
yeah, what do you think we lose as individuals, as a society, as a culture, as people by not being more educated in death, by losing that connection to how to process and move through it? What are we losing,
um
or how does it
I
harm us?
think we might be losing some of that. Again, the ability to empower ourselves, to build resilience within ourselves, to be with death and dying. Some of the thanatology research talks about the fact that when children are exposed to death, because they may live in an environment where there is war or famine or a higher risk of death, they do build resiliency from that, because right, they're in that kind of environment. um, and I think some of that may provide some resilience building for people, or for them to know how to be with that particular stage. I think we've also medicalized death in the same way that we have medicalized birth. And so it's an attempt to say birthing and dying are not medical events. They are human events that may require some medical intervention. But I would say probably 60 or 80% of the time, they may not require as much medical intervention as we think that they will. But it does, for both, require caregivers, right? Folks who will circle around not only the person, but also the family, right? Um, and I think that maybe part of the influence, especially in the West, is because we are so hyper individualized that it's like it's your responsibility. In other parts of the world, I don't think they have an ignorance or a denial. I think it is part of sometimes an everyday thing or what you do. Even in Eastern Europe, when I went to visit my parents in the fall, October 31st or November 1st, we went to the cemetery to clean off the leaves and to light a candle and to refresh and to reconnect with our ancestors. It wasn't about candy and Halloween and ghosts. Well, ghosts, yes. It is about the reconnection, right? Very similar to the Day of the Dead, other practices. But I think there might also have been a bit of a resistance in some of the cultures around the world to share some of that um, different way of doing death, because sometimes I think, especially the privileged white class, ooh, that's gross. That's weird. No, it's different than yours.
Mhm. Yeah.
And yet we have this fascination, this fascination to I want to have a Viking burial at the sea, or I want the vultures to eat me like they do in, Tibet. And then they lose the understanding of those cultural norms. And some of the reason why that happens is it's only religious or faith, but it's because of the environment.
Mhm.
It's hard to bury people in a very rocky environment, so you do have to dispose of human remains in different ways.
Mm. And so and so then you now end up as a death doula, end of life caregiver. How did that kind of come to be in your life?
Well, part of that was through my nursing and recognizing that I didn't have all the information, so I wanted to really learn a more holistic approach to end of life care. And then what I found through the process is that I love reading. I love to study. I have a very inquisitive mind, although my short-term memory is to be desired. But I love engaging in intellectual conversations. And so the education part is what really drew me then to combine all of those things. And so I guess it was probably 8 years ago, there was a young woman from Nova Scotia who created Beyond Yonder Death Caring virtual training. And it was, to my awareness, it was the first kind of doula training. It wasn't about professionalizing it. It wasn't about getting a certificate. It was about how to gain the skills so that you know how to support your family and potentially community members, and maybe making it, something that you can offer. And that kind of started my interest and the path that I have followed to be immersed in education. So I teach for two colleges. One is for the Thanatology program, and the other is for the End of Life Doula. And then I'm developing, my own kind of grief education. So I'm also diving deeper into the psychedelic world as a way of offering some of that education to folks, how to. So that's been a huge interest. And because the doula role fundamentally really is a companion, it's non medical, but there is learning about the spiritual aspect, the emotional aspect, the mental aspect in relationship to how taxing it can be and all the things you have to remember, right? Our dying is not the way that the dying is the same, but the circumstances of the dying is quite different. And even the dying is a bit different as well, obviously, because we are now able to live longer with more illnesses. And so it maybe is more complex, and on one hand, the unexpected deaths are quick and you don't have to, right? It's like, how do we find that happy medium between having something whoop, and it's done, and something that we can observe. So
Mm.
my world has collided now to kind of be professional, personal. I'm known in my community as the doula lady or the death doula lady, right? And that's what I do for maintaining my life. But it's much more than that. I do this on my off time. And so I also recognize that I need to do a lot of self-care. I need to take care of myself, because one of the things I've noticed in the last couple of years, and partly because I went through a loss, separation, relationship, marriage, is that I lost a bit of my capacity to give to others when I needed to care for myself when I was hit with that loss, right? So I recognize, oh boy, and so anytime that I'm engaged with the material, I think about, oh, got to get that will done. Oh, who's that going to go to? I need a doula team to
Mm.
get me ready, even for the unexpected death, right? That's what sometimes brings up a little bit of my anxiety.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of things in what you just said. Even I really appreciate that you touch on grief and loss and death in different types of relationships that we typically don't consider a death. But even in my own journey, my separation has felt like the person has died. I will never have a relationship with this person again. So in my world, they're dead, and it's really hard. It's really hard because they're not dead to anyone else in my life. But I'm finding myself going through the same emotions and set of, you know, habits or behaviors that I would experience when someone I love dies. And I think that there's a place in grief work as well for that. Um,
Absolutely.
yeah.
And this is where the thanatology comes in. So the thanatologist in me wants to expand and inform some of the groups that are coming out. So when I teach, I talk about the fact I don't use the term loved ones,
Mm.
because I want to serve all folks, and relationships are very complex and dynamic. Then you may find that you're caring for a family or working with a family where there may not be a lot of love, or the love is different, or it's complicated, or what have you. So I don't use the word because it excludes people. In the same way that I don't talk about loss and grief as only something that you experience because a person has died, because again, what we feel is called disenfranchised grief. And especially with divorce and separation, because I had moments in my own separation, yes, I came to a point where actually where I it was best for me to separate from this person, not because I didn't love them, but because the behavior that was happening was not conducive to my care, or even, dare I say, safety. And so I still care for that person, but the relationship no longer works, right? And so trying to find somebody, especially in your own circle, who's invested in, that's the bad person, right? Good riddance. And I'm trying to say, but I miss them. I miss these little moments. I miss the times when I'm alone, or I miss the times of hanging out. I miss their laughter, or, oh, I can't put up the drapes because I'm not strong enough, and I miss them. Some of those secondary losses. But it's hard to find someone who's able to, yeah, right?
Mhm.
I get it. Because most of my friends are invested in seeing him as the bad guy. And so, or stay strong or whatever. You can do it, right? Where it's like, I know, and I'll get to that, but I need a little room for someone to say, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, I'm sure you do.
Mhm. So, do you have any tips?
you know, I think the one thing, again, it's unfortunate, but this is where we are right now because most of us feel uncertain as to what to say to folks when we're supporting them. And so, just in the same way that Megan Devine, I don't know if you know her, but she's an American psychotherapist, and she wrote a little book called "It's Okay That You're Not Okay," because we've also come to this place of this positive toxicity. And I get it. Most people get over it. There's more fish in the sea. You're so young, I don't want you to think, I don't want you to be sad. And so, unfortunately, where we are right now is that we have to train the people that are supporting us to inform them of how and what kind of support that we need. So, my tip would be to ask. I don't need you to downplay him, I don't need you to talk bad about him. I just need you to listen without saying anything about how I may miss this person who most people don't care for anymore. Here's how I need you to listen. Here's how what would help me, right? And then that, again, because it takes a lot, right? You're like, I wish somebody would just do it for me, and it's frustrating. But let us give some grace as we're learning together on how to do this, how to support each other,
Mhm.
right? I may sometimes say to a friend, at this point in time, I don't have a capacity to listen to your problems. So don't dump in. What I need is comfort right now. Are you able to give that to me? And it's okay if you say no, because I, again, want people in my circle to be authentic. And so I need to create some of that room.
Mhm, absolutely. And I think it's, knowing what you need is also something that we have to learn for ourselves, right? Knowing what to ask for. And that in itself is a lot of work because
Absolutely.
we
So
might never get
sometimes
the time.
when I work with clients, I say, let's see what you need. Do you need comfort? Right? Do you need a distraction? Or do you need some strategy, right? Because sometimes it might be, I can't get these thoughts out of my head. I need a strategy to move or a distraction. Or I need comfort. I need to take these thoughts and speak them out loud so that they're validated, normalized, I'm seen. So, you might want to ask, do I need comfort? And that's absolutely, of course you do. Do I need a distraction? Absolutely, right? That's normal part. That's why I say to the doulas, don't take everything away from the family that they can do themselves. Sometimes doing the dishes and the laundry is what you need to feel like your life is okay or normal. And then, what's the potential strategy, right? What have you already done? Right? So it's asking you, what have you already done? What do you know that works? Do that. And maybe here's another one more to add.
Mhm. I love that. One of the questions I have is what do death doulas not do that people sometimes assume?
And that's a very good question. And I actually saw an article that I saw through Facebook, but it was HuffPost or something, and it was an end of life doula in the States. And when I was reading the article, one of the things they talked about was that they were providing post death care. So they were washing the person after they had died. And I was like, well, because that is one of the things for Canadian doulas and the training. I can only speak to the training that I'm part of. I'm hoping that the other training are following suit. But we death doulas don't provide hands-on post death care to the decedent, right? They offer some of the support and suggestions, help, assistance to the family after somebody dies. Of course, they can do that, but not on a hands on. In that saying, doulas also are not personal support workers, they're not healthcare aides. So they don't toilet people or give them baths, maybe wash their hair if they know how to do that. Because again, doulas fundamentally are not trained to do body mechanics or moving people and so on. We may in Canada get to that point. I think it will really depend on many, many different things, and that could be a whole other podcast um, session. But they may, many doulas will have other training. And so, what I suggest to them is maybe not maybe list all of the things. So I'm a personal support worker, end of life doula, life celebrant, Reiki practitioner, and sometimes there's a whole list. Or they use end of life personal support worker, right? Or end of life social worker, or end of life psychotherapist, or whatever, so that they can better identify what the field they work in, but that they're maintaining within the scope of this particular professional practice, as I said, like a support worker, personal support worker.
Mm.
Doulas also, while they can provide information about estates and legal wills and power of attorney and those kinds of things, they're not legal. They're not legal practitioners, right? They're not legal aides. Unless they are, then they might be really well positioned to offer that kind of support. But they are informed of what would be helpful for people to do in order to reduce some of the stresses or the burdens, right? So it's how a doula can help facilitate those conversations and then obtain what is needed. And a family may hire a doula maybe for the all of it, right? Looking at it in the same way, death certificate as opposed to a birth certificate. How do you do this? And those kind of, have you set up a social insurance, that kind of stuff, similar to birth and death. They could assist in that process and then help the family, the person, to better identify their particular goals for care, their particular plan for the dying experience, whatever that may be, because it may be different for many different people. And they may be present with or offer support to the family and the caregivers during that vigiling time, and then afterwards as well. And they may also offer grief support, but again, they're not grief counselors, they're not therapists, right? So they're more as a enhancement to the care, right? I sometimes will say to doulas, it's best if you're not the only person, hopefully there is that connection to a primary healthcare provider, potentially community care, support. So, and that's why I also encourage doulas to form teams, because they will be much better equipped in providing that support to a family. I cannot be the doula to all people, right? And part of that is my own experience that informs a lot of my own knowledge. So I'm really good at helping folks who are single and may not have kids, but are worried about their pets, or, how to navigate some of those kinds of things.
Mm-hmm. That's beautiful. And so, are you providing services to the person who is dying, or the family, or both, or sometimes one or the other? Who is it that typically is reaching out?
Yes. It's all of it. It's whatever the need is. So I have had clients who I work with one-on-one, and I've helped a client write letters to their grandkids in the future, the birthday presents, and help them to kind of practice creating boundaries around their care when friends are calling all the time and they're just, I don't have the energy, I'm dying, you know. Um, and I've helped family navigate when mom, dad, brother,
Mhm.
right? So it really depends. Doulas have to be very flexible. They're kind of like the eye in the storm. Everything is moving, everything is chaotic, and they're very zen. They can be very zen. It doesn't mean that they're not. They can be moved to emotion, right? But they're the calm. Okay, they're the let's breathe. Hopefully they're doing all of their own good self-care and balancing and grounding and nurturing ways, and that, right? And then really working with a family to identify what their particular needs are, and then saying, sounds like I'm not your person, but I can hear, I can send someone who I think will be able to offer what you're looking for. So every family will be very unique. I when I meet with clients, will talk about the fact that there might be times when I may have a conversation with the person who's dying as a way of helping them to unburden themselves and that sometimes those conversations will be in confidence because they're helping them through some of the stuff, right? And then there might be times with the family as well where I may serve as that witnesser or someone. But when we are creating a plan, when we are, then it's together. It's facilitating those meetings. It's helping people to understand, to get more clarity. And we play games, right? We play the end of life deck or the go wish deck as a way of expanding our understanding, because most families, you would think, but they don't. And it's not about that they're ignorant. It's not a pleasant thing to talk about. At the same time, though, I think it can be fun as well. My parents eventually, they will get to a point where in our conversation they'll say, okay, that's enough. It's okay, because it's not a one-time thing. So back to the education. If we within our education find those teachable moments, and we maybe support families in having the confidence to not replace the fish or the cat or the dog right away, but to capture that moment as a way of sharing the cycle of life, and how to be with this really impactful thing that has happened, then I think that will help build, right? But again, we have this pressure from our society that says you need to be young, you need to be productive, there's always a new thing, there's always an updated thing. And if you don't have that, then you're not in. Yeah, and that's what's sometimes influencing the not wanting to talk about.
Mhm.
I've been in those circles where the moment I mention I'm a end of life or a death, whatever, right? And now people are like, "Oh, what's that? Oh, that's interesting." Right? So there's a little bit of a lean in now rather than a kind of a recoil.
That's the reason I finally felt okay to start this podcast, because
Yeah.
for honestly 2 decades this has been something I've wanted to talk to, and people just they don't want to. They just think
And,
it's
and
this bizarre passion of mine.
I think podcasts are great. They're great because the control is not up to you and I, right? That's part of the threatening nature. If I engage with Olga, then I won't be able to tell her to stop when I'm feeling uncomfortable, or I won't know how to be with myself, right? And it is again so important to say to the family, right? At any point in time, I can stop. I know this is not easy, right? And I will always tell them I have no idea what dying's all about. Never been there. I don't know. I have been witness to, I've supported the end of life process. And so I can only offer what I know from that perspective. And I have no idea what it will be like for you. But I'm willing to, and I'm able to sit with you, to be with you, to navigate this transition, this rite of passage, and hopefully not only make it less painful, but hopefully add some beauty or some healing or something that it's not that you're not going to feel sad and you're not going to grieve. Of course you will, but there will be some grace in that moment.
Absolutely. You mentioned a little bit about, helping support boundaries of those who are dying, helping, keep their wishes. What are some things, and obviously this would be different all across all across different lives, but what are some things that you think the dying want us to know? If we are, those around someone who's dying, what is it that they maybe have a hard time telling us that they might tell you? Or things that you kind of see come up that we could know to be better supports or family members or friends during those times?
Um, I think there's a lot of literature written about what the dying people want. There's actually a really good book called What the Dying People Want. I think again there's often the reflecting back and the missed moments. I think in general, again, general is very general. but I wish I would have worked less and loved more and spent more time with my family and those kinds of things. But I've also found that sometimes people do come to the point in their life at the end where they're not missing the things that they could have done. I think that they're disappointed. I might, I can anticipate I may have a little bit of this because it really depends on the personality of the person. Like even this morning, I was having a conversation with someone and it was about fraud. And I was thinking, oh, it makes me so sad that we as humans have this beautiful, bountiful planet and can create wonderful things. And yet we still hurt each other, not out of unconscious ignorance, but out of conscious willful hurtfulness. And I think I may be a bit sad when I'm dying that people are still that way. That's so I think that there's going to be those sad moments. And that's kind of the reality, right? I think we can't always have joy and pleasure and happiness. I think that without loss, we may not have that ability to have gratitude for things, right?
Mm.
Without the darkness, we don't know what the light is, right? The shadow has the illumination of things. So I don't know. I think most people at the end of their life when they're dying, they may appreciate someone who's willing to listen to their story. I want to tell my story one last time from what I know. And here's the really interesting thing is that it's also an opportunity. And I think maybe again, instead of putting the responsibility on the person who's dying to say, this is what I want, maybe it's the people who are caring for them to say, can you tell me about a story that is going to die with you? And unless you tell it, I will not be able to have it, especially when it's a story about me. And I don't mean to be narcissistic, but I think about the fact that when my parents died, my childhood, the memories of my childhood, because I can't, not to the totality that my mother or father can, that's going to die with them.
Mhm.
And so maybe my request to my parents and what I had started doing is tell me a little bit about how was I born? What time was it? How much did I weigh? What were the circumstances of my birth? What are these memories that I have? I had this one memory as an example. I had this one memory that I was with my mother somewhere and I thought it was my grandfather, but this older gentleman had an amputated leg. And I had in this memory the way in which the pants were rolled up and pinned on either side. And I remember sharing it with my mom, and she said, that was a friend of your grandfather's. It wasn't your grandfather, and you never met him when you were a child. I met him once when I was pregnant with you. And I thought, what? What? Wow. These deep seated memories that are DNA linked, right? That's what is so interesting, right? Those kind of
Mhm.
stories that will die. That was part of my loss with my relationship is because my ex-husband, I thought, and I think he did, he knew the totality of me.
Mm.
He was the only person.
Mhm.
My parents know that the child me.
Yeah.
They still ask me, what is it that you're doing? What are you doing for
Yeah.
work? Which is very sweet. And I can appreciate that. So it's, maybe it's the family saying, tell me the stories before you go, tell me the stories.
Mhm. Or correct the stories I thought I knew.
Right. I mean, think about the perception, think about how maybe again the possibility of huge healing for people.
Yeah.
When I tell you, as your mother that actually I didn't reject you. I had to have your aunt take care of you because I was working three jobs, but as a
Mhm.
3-year-old, you had no idea. You were like Dr. Gabor Mate when his mother left him for someone to care for him because I need to save this babies. The Nazis are going to kill me. And he took it in as I was rejected by my mother, which wasn't true.
Yeah.
So there's huge possibility. And I think this is where, there is that potential. But again, there's a risk, especially if a doula may not be well versed in some of the things that arise in the dying process, not only for the person who's dying, but for the person who's grieving, who's interconnected. I think that there are, again, I can't prove anything. I can only speak from my own experience. I think that we are energetically linked, right? Especially to the DNA that we share with people, but also our intimate connections. There's a little bit of DNA exchange in those intimate connections. And I think that when we separate, there is pain in the DNA physical form, but especially when the person dies, right? Those big impacts when your mother, father, child, spouse, right? Boom. Because they're so, I don't know, energetically somehow connected. Those ties are so strong. My mother, it's happened twice in my life. When I was in my 30s, my mother had what I think was actually an anxiety or panic attack, but it was labeled as a heart attack. And I was, yes, it was in my 20s. I was at the time in British Columbia, and I felt the pain. I thought something was happening to me, but it wasn't. It was happening to her. And the same thing happened last year with my mom. She actually did have a mild heart attack, and I had to actually take myself to the hospital to make sure I was not having a heart attack. And my parents are, of that generation where they don't want to burden their children with anything. So they never told me until after, oh, by the way, mom was in the hospital. She almost died. She's okay now. And I'm like, what? No wonder. I knew something was happening. So now I tell them, you have to tell me because I'm going to start having some pain and I won't know why. And I hope that here's the really interesting thing. I don't know if that's true. I don't know what to make of it. But I hope that I do get that signal that when something is going south with my parents, I will have that signal and potentially could then be there or, send them energy for whatever they're going to do with it at the time. Interesting, right? I wonder. I mean, so many of the things that we didn't know, we are now finding out through the ability of seeing inside of the body, inside of the brain, capturing energy, right? So who knows? Who knows? It might be true. 50 years from now, somebody will say, that Olga, she talked about that. She talked about the ties and how, that's part of the pain.
Well, I always say, well, the longer we're here, the more we figure out and the more we explore. So that's one realm of things that we could do a lot more work on.
Who knows?
For those who feel inspired or curious to be a death doula or end of life doula, what do you suggest they ask themselves first before maybe going down that road?
I think maybe how do they want to serve? Right? I think that there is a little bit of fascination, romanticism with the death doula. I don't think we currently do not, as far as I know, have a certified, I don't want to say certifiable because that's something else, a certified course to the degree of the birth doulas. The birth doulas have a certificate course. They actually get certified through the process. And so, death doulas are non-regulated. And so there are many different kind of offerings who may say that they are certified, but you have a certificate of completion or an organization makes you certified because they're observing some of your work. And so while you're kind of under their umbrella, you are certified in that way. But once you're, right? So there isn't a college or a thing that certifies doulas. So I think one is look at what you're interested in, and then find a resource that is in the community or in the province or in the country in which you're in. Partly I say that because while there are, of course, these spiritual, emotional aspects of um, the care, I think it's good for doulas to also know the landscape where this work happens. If as a doula, you're not informed of the advanced care planning process, or let me say the decision-making process, and who has the responsibility and authority and under what circumstances, then you may be giving maybe your family wrong information, or you're not able to give them any information because you don't understand the landscape, right? So unless you're um and so that's what I would say. Same thing with, post-death stuff, right? Funeral things. It's good to have the knowledge of what happens in your community, because there's a lot of folks who are very jazzed about alkaline hydrolysis and very eco-friendly, eco-conscious body disposition composting, but it's not available
Mm.
in the location where you are or to the families that you're serving. So it makes no sense to say, would you like this or would you like that? Because if it's not available, it may not be a best option for the people, right?
Mhm.
And I think that's what doulas, where they can serve, where I see the largest gap is people don't know what they don't know. And if they've never gone through the process, then they're only obtaining information from the medical community, and they may not know of the different options and choices. And then there are sort of at the mercy of the funeral director that they have, without, again, maybe knowing and understanding their rights and how they can empower themselves through the process. I think that there is a doula movement, right? So beyond training, beyond certification, there are many folks who are informally or pseudo formally trained in some aspect of this work. And so they're really maybe putting a little bit of emphasis or pressure on the reform of some of these particular processes, right?
Mhm.
Specifically when it comes to medically assistance in dying, or not, but specifically around some of the funeral reform, especially around body disposition, and also helping families to recognize and to know that they can do a lot of the post death care themselves. They can wash their person, they can anoint their person, they can vigil after that, they can obtain a beautiful container, they can decorate it, they can take their person to the crematorium if they're family. Like, these are all of the things that I think is helpful for families to know and to engage in, so that again they can feel included in the process. I think one of the detriment and the harm is that someone's sick, we get out of the way. Someone's dying, we get out of the way. Someone's dead, we get out of the way. Instead of giving folks, as I said, the confidence and the competence to say, okay, what part of this can I do? Am I allowed to do? How do I engage in this process? What we know is that when people are more engaged in the rites and in that rite of passage, and they find meaning and they find a story inside of that experience, then it reduces some of that contraction or the loss, right? Consider a double loss that happens. I can't care for my person, loss. Somebody else has to. I can't be with my person, loss. Somebody else has to, right? I can't drive my person, or whatever it is. There are those secondary losses that we may not realize, right? I think it's very similar within, the healthcare system and the way in which we train nurses, physicians, right? I'm going to tell you what you have to do, but it's a disempowerment, right? So fundamentally, I think to the doula movement is also to educate people. What happens at the end of death? Oh, that noisy stuff happens. Oh, they're not in pain. No, they just got some spit, that they can't swallow, right? So educate people. Give them then the ability to advocate for themselves. I know this, and this is what I would like, so they can be more empowered in whatever. They can't do everything. So, not that whatever you wish for is going to translate into decisions and that's what's going to happen. We need to also help families manage some of those expectations, right? What's available, what's not. I think that's the other thing, is that there's a risk of those that have relied on the system. There is thinking that when the time comes, it will be there for me. And I can tell you that it may not be.
Mhm.
And so that's what motivates me to continue to educate, to inform, so that people, when they find that they don't have the support from the resources that they've relied on, they have still the ability to care for themselves and others.
Olga, this has been so enlightening and inspiring and empowering. Is there anything you feel has been left unsaid, or something that you want people to think about or take away with them?
So much. Like I said, right? Let me not get started on the politics of the body, the similar of birth and death, right? Then there's the whole influence of medically assistance in dying. What I would say as a kind of a last thought is, I talk about end of life being relational and holistic, right? So relational and holistic. And it is still a mystery. It's still a mystery, right? Where would I, or that which identify as I, where will I go once this container is done?
Mhm.
Interesting.
Thank you so much for having this conversation with me.
Thanks for inviting me, Jenna. I really appreciated your time.